All right. Should be recorded. Just making sure that it's recording. Okay. And the recording of the presentation will be posted on mass.gov/2030 CECP website within a week. Please remain on mute during the upcoming presentation, and there will be an opportunity after the presentation for questions and discussion. Please reserve the chat box for letting us know if you have any logistical issues that you may be experiencing, or for submitting questions. Written comments should not be put in the chat box. We kindly ask that you put your written comments in an email and send it to gwsa@mass.gov, and we will do proper accounting of written comments there. Lastly, if you haven't already done so, please make sure your first name and your last name and affiliation, if you have one, are displayed in the participants list. You can do that by hovering over your name in the participants list, and there should be an option to rename yourself, and you can do so anytime during this meeting. All right, that's it for logistics. I will now turn it over to Judy Chang, our Undersecretary for Energy and Climate Solutions. Undersecretary.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, happy holidays to everyone, and hope that you do get to spend some time with your loved ones during this holiday season. Before we go off on holidays, we wanted to get a chance to have this dialogue with everyone about natural and working land and strategies for our clean energy and climate plan. I just want to say hello to everyone and welcome for your participation. In this presentation, we will go through first the statutory requirements related to the Massachusetts Clean Energy Climate Plan, as well as the overall process of developing the CECP for 2025 and 2030. We will then go over our approach for developing the goals in reducing the greenhouse gas emissions and enhancing carbon sequestration capabilities on our natural working land, and of course, the strategies and actions to achieve those goals. As you know, this is a part of our long-term plan to reduce emissions, greenhouse gas emissions from our economy. Not only do we have to be aggressive in reducing the actual emissions from all sectors of our economy, we will also need to rely on our land and our natural working lands to help us sequester and store any leftover greenhouse gas emissions out in the 2050 timeframe. We will summarize for you some of the public comments that we have received through the interim CECP that was presented at the end of last year, particularly focusing on natural and working land strategies. And then also what our plans are going forward in receiving additional stakeholder feedback on these strategies. After the presentation, Han will be delivering the presentation. After the presentation, we would like to receive your feedback on these strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and enhancing our carbon sequestration capabilities through our natural working lands. We'll answer your questions on the presentation today, but also in general, if you have additional questions, as Han mentioned earlier, you're welcome to contact us through the email or any other ways to engage with us. So again, this is a public forum to talk about and to share with you our approach and our strategies. So thank you very much for joining us, particularly during this very busy time of the year. And I will hand that back to Han. Thank you.
Thank you, Undersecretary. All right. So I'll get this started. Let's start off with a quick refresher for those who are not familiar with our most recent Clean Energy and Climate Plan. We conducted a 2-year comprehensive study starting in 2018 at the cost-effective and equitable strategies for achieving net zero emissions in the Commonwealth by 2050. This analysis accumulated in a synthesis report and 5 typical appendices that we released on mass.gov/2050 roadmap website last December. Informed by the findings of that study, our Secretary Kathleen Theoharides, set the 2030 emissions limits at 45% below the 1990 baseline level and released the interim Clean Energy and Climate Plan for 2030 that established the blueprint for achieving the emissions limit equitably and affordably, with major new incentives advancing the decarbonization of our buildings, transportation, and electric sectors. We had public meetings on both the 2050 roadmap findings and the interim 2030 plan, and solicited public comments on the interim 2030 plan between January 7 and March 22nd. While we received the public comments on the 2030 plan, the interim 2030 plan, the administration was in discussion with legislators on areas for improvement in the S9 legislation. And then on March 26th, Governor Baker signed into law an act creating a next generation roadmap for Massachusetts climate policy, which requires that the EEA secretary to set the statewide greenhouse gas emissions limits for every 5 years between 2020 and 2050, set sector-based statewide emissions sublimits, and develop a roadmap plan to realize each emissions limit. The new climate law further specifies that the 2030 emissions limits shall be at least 50% emissions reduction below the 1990 level. The 2040 emissions limit shall be at least 75% below the 1990 level, and the 2050 emissions limit shall be at least 85% emissions reduction and achieve at least net zero greenhouse gas emissions. The law also requires the Secretary to adopt statewide emissions limits by July, emissions limit and sublimits by July 1, 2022, as well as release a comprehensive, clear, and specific plan to achieve those emissions limits and sublimits also by July 1. 6 months later, we are to set the emissions sublimits and release the Clean Energy and Climate Plan for 2050, which will be updated and revised every 5 years afterwards, when we'll release the Clean Energy and Climate Plan for 2035, the CECP for 2040, the CECP for 2045. Additionally, the new climate law added new requirements to the plan to achieve each emissions limits, including measuring and tracking carbon flux on your natural and working lands, setting goals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and increase carbon sequestration on our natural and working lands, and outlining actions to achieve these goals. As our executive office fulfills new statutory requirements and work to complete the Clean Energy and Climate Plan for 2025 and 2030, we will continue to accept comments and questions on emissions limits and sublimits, plans to achieve them, and other related topics at gwsa@mass.gov. The 2025 and 2030 plan will have strategies, policies, and programs that aim to help Massachusetts reach 50% emissions reduction by 2030, with more specificity and clearer timeline. We are also significantly expanding the discussion of equity and just transition in the plan and developing equitable policies and programs. And we are, in compliance with the new requirements on natural working lands, we are developing goals, strategies, and policies programs that aim to lower greenhouse gas emissions while enhancing carbon sequestration on natural and working lands. We have been tracking the implementation of the Clean Energy and Climate Plan for 2020 on mass.gov/GWSA website, but will improve the visibility of our progress tracking moving forward. We will continue to update you all on the development of the 2025 and 2030 plan on mass.gov/2030 CECP. Our work plan to complete the 2025 and 2030 CECP includes updating the energy pathways analysis and forest carbon analysis that we did last year for the 2050 roadmap study, assessing macroeconomic and jobs impact for our policy portfolio, developing an improved statewide inventory of carbon flux on our natural working lands, setting a baseline of carbon flux on our natural working lands and goals for increasing the net carbon sequestration in our Commonwealth, and holding public meetings on our proposed strategies and policies to achieve emissions reduction targets and carbon sequestration goals. We held a series of public meetings in October on our proposed approach for completing the 2025 and 2030 CECP and gathered feedback on our proposal to set limits on gross emissions while tracking and lowering net emissions through goal setting and policy development. Set sector-specific emission sublimits to be consistent with the categories already in the statewide greenhouse gas emissions inventory, and finalize the interim 2030 CECP to be the new Clean Energy and Climate Plan for 2025 and 2030, being one document, after additional analysis and stakeholder engagement. Next March, we will have another set of public meetings where we will present and gather feedback on our proposed emissions limits and sublimits for 2025 and 2030, proposed goals for reducing emissions from and increasing carbon sequestration on national working lands, and proposed policy portfolio that aim to achieve these emissions limits, sublimits, and national working land goals. Our process for developing goals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and enhance carbon sequestration on national working lands, as well as strategies to achieve those goals, is informed by science. And so the next few slides, I'll be going over the preliminary results of our inventory upgrade. But before I do that, let me talk about the current understanding of greenhouse gas fluxes. This here is a simple diagram of the different greenhouse gas fluxes that we are aware of. On the left-hand side of this graph are direct anthropogenic emissions, gross emissions, from the combustion of fossil fuel and the use of short-lived climate pollutants, such as HFCs and SF6 in industrial processes. And the right-hand side are the greenhouse gas fluxes associated with biogenic biological sources. The biggest box here are the greenhouse gas fluxes associated with national working lands, trees, the forest, wetlands, and croplands. But a part of that, of the biogenic emissions, are the combustion and degradation, decomposition of national working land products, which emit greenhouse gas emissions. As you can see on the left-hand side, there are very few arrows to represent the greenhouse gas fluxes. It's a lot easier to inventory, and MassDEP has done a phenomenal job updating the methodology to track on a statewide basis annually the greenhouse gas emissions from direct anthropogenic emissions. And then they also did some inventorying of the biogenic emissions on the left-hand side, particularly from the combustion of national working land derived products for energy consumption. We are doing a lot in order to track greenhouse gas, net greenhouse gas emissions to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. We have to do a lot more to track all the fluxes that are happening on the right-hand side, and we are going to do our best to use the existing science that we have and data sources that we have to do that. So the next slide, I will go more deeply into the right-hand side of this graph, the biogenic emissions. This graph here is all the biogenic greenhouse gas fluxes that we have in our current methodology, which was developed around 2010, 2011, based on best available data at that time. And so the pink line here is the biogenic emission from bioenergy sources, combustion of biomass, biofuel, biogas for the production of electricity, but then also in vehicle usage and in oil boilers, etc. The next line is the blue, brown line is associated with the loss of forest as provided by data sources, two data sources that we were able to get back then. One data point being 1989, and then the other data source is 2006. In between the two data sources, we make assumptions of forest loss by using the building permit data to estimate how many acres of forest are lost in between those two data sources, two data points. The next line I'd like you to look at is the green line. That represents the forest sequestration, again, based on two data sources that we have at that time in the early and late 1980s, early 1990s, and then the other data point was in 2005, 2006. And we use FIA data to estimate the sequestration rate associated with the forest sequestration. But the FIA data at that time was also based on limited data that was collected on 5-year intervals. And so there is a lot of oversimplification in this line, in this green line here. As you can see, that it is a lot straighter than what you would normally see in real, if you were to do measuring. And then the next line I want your attention to turn your attention to is the blue line. This blue line is the net national working land emissions from taking the green line and subtracting the brown line from it. This represents what our national working lands are net emitting, or in this case, because it's a negative number, net storing in our national working lands. And the brown and the black line here represents total net biogenic emissions after we add back on the biogenic emissions from combustion. So this current inventory says that our net biogenic emissions is about 7.4 million metric tons a year, which is a negative number, so which means it's a storage of about 7.5 million metric tons a year. We need to update this inventory, like I said, because it was based on very limited data. And then we also have to update it to look at additional national working lands as required by the climate law. This inventory methodology only looks at forests. It doesn't look at wetlands or croplands or urban areas that do have vegetation. And then we also want to update this inventory to be more spatially explicit. Instead of just one number for the entire state of Massachusetts, we wanted to be able to look at different parts of Massachusetts to understand where the carbon stores are most rich, as well as to help with municipalities and regions understand better the net carbon sequestration happening in their particular area. So this line here is our current preliminary update to the inventory of just the natural working lands emissions. So we left the pink line alone because Mass DEP has been updating this methodology based on federal data sources. And they do this on a regular basis using EPA emission factors. So we are not changing the methodology behind this pink line. What we are changing is the methodology behind what was the green line and the brown line. So the brown line is being replaced by 3 wedges here that represent greenhouse gas emissions from wetlands, agricultural soils, and forest lost. Again, these are preliminary estimates, so we think that the emissions from wetlands are a little high, on the high side, and we are working to get better numbers for wetlands. So the green line is being replaced by 7, if I can count right, wedges here. The wedges being carbon storage by the organic waste that hasn't been combusted or has been slower to deteriorate. And then the next wedge here is the carbon stored in harvested wood products. The green line, the green wedge here from the bottom, here is the afforestation, basically new forest land, the carbon stored in new forest land. And then the lighter green line is the carbon stored in urban trees. And then the deeper green wedge, the biggest one here, is the carbon stored in existing forest. And so you can kind of see that the net, the blue line here, the net natural working land emissions, instead of being 12 point something in the current inventory, is now about 7.5 million metric tons. And the net biogenic emissions is smaller. Instead of the 7 point something in the current methodology, this updated preliminary methodology puts it at about 2 million metric tons. And so this is very informative for us to inform like what we need to do to achieve net zero, the strategies to achieve net zero, but then it's also informative to help us understand where are the biggest stores of carbon and where are the sources of greenhouse gas emissions on natural working lands. So I will then next focus on just one data point for you, the blue data point here on the net NWL emissions line. And this data point is for 2018. As you can see in the previous graph and then in this table, that the biggest store of carbon is in our forest land, both live and dead biomass, as well as the forest soil. There is, in the gray text, there is right now a balance, roughly a balance between new forest land and forest lost. And the wetlands, again, there is, I think, a bigger number than we would want, and so we are looking into that. But that right now is the current largest source of greenhouse gas emissions on our natural working lands. I'm going to pause here. Before I go on, I do wanted to point out, it's important this information is important to help us think through what we should protect, what we should better restore. And so it's very important for us to protect the current forests that we have and manage them in a way that they can be resilient beyond 2050. It's not like we reach net zero emissions in 2050 and that's it. We have to maintain at least net zero beyond 2050. So it's very important for us to maintain the carbon stores in our forest in long term. The other important point I wanted to point out is that wetlands, while it is a current source of greenhouse gas emissions based on our preliminary estimates, it has a big amount of carbon storage in it. And so if we continue to manage them and restore them, we can prevent further greenhouse gas emissions, methane emissions from wetlands. They are the second largest store of carbon in our Commonwealth. So, as I mentioned before, we are very interested in protecting national working lands because we want to protect the current carbon stock in our landscape, in our borders. So in the National Working Land Plan, that's going to be part of the Clean Energy and Climate Plan for 2025 and 2030. The most important strategy that we will be pursuing is protect. And then the next important strategy that we are pursuing is to manage national working lands. So that way we can enhance carbon sequestration in our landscape, and as well as making them resilient into the future. In the interim 2030 CECP, we did not have a restore strategy, but given how important wetlands are for the carbon storage of them, we would like to add a strategy to our National Working Land Plan. National Working Land Plan is to restore wetlands, but then also restore other natural working lands, such as planting additional trees in urban areas, planting additional trees in riparian areas, and then exploring additional reforestation and afforestation measures. This is important for us to enhance carbon storage on our natural working lands. The fourth strategy is to incentivize continual long-term carbon storage in our trees once they've been harvested. And this will help us further reach net zero emissions. And then the last strategy here, less important than the other four, but is important in the sense that if we don't decrease gross emissions adequately, we will end the carbon storage and sequestration in our national working lands are not adequate to achieve net zero. We have to explore how to get more carbon sequestration in national working lands outside of Massachusetts or in engineered ways. So those are the five strategies, main strategies that we are pursuing as part of the National Working Land Plan for the Clean Energy and Climate Plan for 2025 and 2030. How are we going to fill out those strategies with policies and actions? We are going to be basing it on a lot of the efforts that EEA and its state agencies have been embarking on, efforts that have carbon implications. For example, the Resilient Lands Initiative that the Executive Office have spearheaded in the last few years is an important effort that we will be drawing upon because it has goals and policies to help us achieve no net loss of forest and farmland. And so we will be drawing a lot on that initiative for the goals to set in our plan, National Working Land Plan, as well as the policies to pursue for the 5 buckets that we have, 5 main strategies that we have. Another document, another effort that we will be drawing very closely on is the Healthy Soils Action Plan, which was also spearheaded by our Executive Office in the last 2 years. And this will provide us, one, better data on soil carbon, but then also policies and strategies for us to increase carbon storage in our soils. You saw in the previous graphs that agricultural soil is a small bit of greenhouse gas emission source in our Commonwealth at the moment, and could we pursue policies in this plan here that can help us lower the emissions from agricultural soil and perhaps even be a net sink of carbon. Another document that we'll be drawing upon is the State Forest Action Plan that have been developed last year and released last year. That plan has for us forest management strategies that we'll be drawing upon to help us on the second main strategy, the manage strategy. In addition to drawing upon all these initiatives and plans and documents, we are engaging technical experts to help us better track and monitor carbon sequestration and carbon emissions on our national working lands. And then from that technical analysis, help us think through the strategies. Additionally, lastly, but certainly very important, is to engage with you all as stakeholders, as members of the public, on what our goals should be and policy suggestions that you have for those goals. We will continue to have public meetings where we will get further feedback from you. And so this next part of the presentation will summarize the public comments that we have received thus far from the public meetings on the interim 2030 CECP, and give you a heads up of more public meetings and stakeholder engagement to come. So as mentioned earlier, we had a public comment period from January to March of this year, where we received over 1,000 comments on the interim plan. The comments came from citizens like you all, municipalities, environmental organizations, many businesses and industries, labor groups, and legislators. Most of the comments raised the need for more commitment, stronger commitment and specificity around equity, environmental justice in policy and support, just transition and workforce development and training programs to build pipelines to high quality, family sustaining jobs for both workers in fossil-based industries, as well as environmental justice populations. And another resounding feedback that we hear is more specificity on funding and financing programs to support decarbonization. Many of these comments were also in support of raising the 2030 emissions limits from 45 to 50%. Thankfully, the climate legislation has codified that for us. And so this slide here summarizes the main sector issues that we received from the comment letters on the land sector chapter of the 2030 interim plan. And so on the topic of forest management, some advocates say that they prefer no tree cutting, especially on public lands, while others prefer climate smart forestry practices, acknowledging the dynamic forest ecosystem and better accounting of forest carbon flows. So you can kind of see that there are two camps here. I'm sure there are a lot of nuances between these perspectives, but it's important for us to summarize what we have heard. The other, on the topic of harvested long-lived wood products, we hear from several groups saying that wood building products have lower carbon than concrete and steel, and they recommend the use of embodied carbon in evaluating building materials. Others raise the concern about the cutting of trees for timber products and suggest the need to account for life cycle of mass timber. On the topic of carbon sequestration and land goals, some advocates prefer specific goals for biogenic carbon sequestration and or conservation, reforestation, and restoration of national working lands, including metrics for measuring our progress. And so this has very much been now part of the statutory requirements of the new climate law. On the topic of urban tree planting, some advocates prefer that we are explicit in our commitment to maintaining and increasing urban tree canopy, particularly in EJ communities. And now, based on that feedback, and the analysis that we have done on the preliminary natural working land inventory, we are now adding to our natural working land plan the third strategy of restore. And a lot of advocates and forestry groups prefer that we have more stakeholder engagement around the land sector analysis and policies. And a few folks wrote in saying that we should not forget about wetlands and blue carbons. And so this today is the first public meeting on the topic of natural working land strategies. And we anticipate 2 more public meetings in this area. The second one is planned for January 14th, 12 to 2 p.m., where we will summarize and gather feedback on key elements of the Resilient Lands Initiative. As you recall, I said earlier, we will be drawing upon this effort quite a bit to help us with the strategies and actions to pursue the 5 strategies that we have: protect, manage, restore, and long-term carbon storage and additional carbon sequestration. And then the third public meeting that we have planned is going to be in February 11th, 12 to 2, where we would like to gather feedback on additional options for reducing emissions and enhancing carbon sequestration on forest lands. We like to focus this meeting on forest land. I'd like to get your feedback in this meeting whether or not we should have additional public meetings on other land cover types. Feel free to pipe up in the second part of this meeting here. So in addition to these public meetings, we plan to have technical workshop in February, date to be determined, but we want to gather feedback from those who are technically inclined on where and how we should define natural working land sector baseline and the scope of it, of the inventory, for us to set goals and assess carbon sequestration over time. More information on these meetings will be emailed out. If you are not on the email list already, you can go on mass.gov/2030 CECP to sign up. There is a link there on that website for you to sign up to get email notices about these meetings. So this concludes our presentation today, and we would really like to get your feedback on the proposed main strategies for reducing emissions and enhancing carbon sequestration on our national working lands. And I put those 5 strategies here on the slide for ease, for your ease of review. To ask a question, you may also ask a question or provide inputs on what we have presented today. And so to ask a question or provide input now, you could click on raise hand, which you can see if you click on the participants icon. Once you click on participants icon, the participant list should show up, and at the bottom is the raise hand feature. We ask that you limit your questions and input to 2 minutes or less to allow others to chime in. And for those who are joining us on the phone, you can press *9 to indicate you would like to speak. And then when it's your turn, we will call on you and you will press *6 to unmute yourself. Again, please let us know if you have any logistical issues raising your hand, and we will try to troubleshoot. Right. Undersecretary Cheng, we have a few hands, but then I also see some people with questions in the chat. Would you like to go to those who have their hands raised first, and then I can intersperse with those folks some questions in the chat? Okay, what we can do that. Let's do that then. So next person on our list is Glenn Ayers.
Hi, thank you very much for this presentation and for taking my question. I have read the Global Warming Solutions Act, and my understanding was that agencies were supposed to calculate their 1990 baseline levels. And so for an agency, if we're talking about forests today, an agency like DCR would need to calculate their greenhouse gas emissions from their active logging program. And they've been logging thousands of acres, and those are a source of greenhouse gases, and they remain a source for decades until the forest recovers. So why haven't these agencies done an analysis under the Global Warming Solutions Act to set their 1990 baseline levels and then come up with a plan to reduce their emissions by 50% by 2030? Instead, you're using a ridiculous net emissions level and saying that all of the forest destruction that is happening doesn't count because the forest is storing overall over 1 million acres. The forest is storing more than it's emitting. So therefore, we can ignore the active timber management that DCR is conducting on our public lands. I just don't think you understand the issue, or you're intentionally avoiding it. So please make them calculate their 1990 baseline levels from their historic logging program and then come up with a plan to reduce it by 50% by, well, in 8 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn, for your comment. So if I may, I just want to clarify something. The Global Warming Solutions Act specifies that the emissions limit should be set on sources of greenhouse gas emissions, and they didn't define those sources of greenhouse gas emissions to include national working lands. It's only in this new climate legislation, climate law, that specifically incorporate national working lands and ask us to track. And so just to clarify that it's not until this climate legislation that we are looking at biogenic emissions towards statutory compliance. So that's just one clarification. And the other clarification is for the National Working Lands Inventory. You notice in one of my slides that we do have a bucket for harvested wood. And we also did analysis as part of 2050 roadmap where we looked at the emissions associated with timber activities. And so moving forward in the new inventory on national working lands, we will be basing a lot of the, we will be updating a lot of the national working lands emissions from that analysis, but then doing further tracking of carbon flows. And so we are in conversations with DCR staff on assessing the timber harvest in Massachusetts as far back as they have records for, and then we will incorporate that into the inventory. And so it will show up in our inventory moving forward on a net emissions basis. Does that answer your question, Glenn? Thank you. If you wanted to further refine, or we can also note your suggestion there. Okay, we're gonna go next to Kate Conlon.
Hi. I own forest land in Buckland that is enrolled in Chapter 61, along with many of my neighbors and friends out here in Western Franklin County. We're not developers, but we see the pressure of development all around us. The average landowner out here is a senior citizen, so there's going to be a major land transfer in the coming years. With the newly increased ability for people to work remotely, what will prevent forest land from being further parcelized? Massachusetts loses 7,000 acres of forest land a year right now. Without targeted policy, this will get worse. The best way to keep forests intact is to incentivize what many of us already want to do. Chapter 61, sustainable timber harvest, carbon credits, conservation restrictions, and outright purchase of land for permanent conservation by the government or private organizations are all necessary to reduce the financial burden of landowners. The wood heating my home right now grew only a few hundred feet away. According to UMass Amherst, however, Massachusetts imports 98% of its wood needs. Since an act creating a next generation roadmap considers direct emissions to include transportation and the manufacturing process, I urge the committee to consider the environmental cost of this import. Climate change does not acknowledge state borders. Our woods are seeing new invasive pests every year, and our changing climate is creating conditions where some of our native insects and fungi are able to cause catastrophic damage. A hands-off approach not only places the environmental burden on faraway places for our wood needs, but removes our ability to manage the woods and act in a timely manner to alleviate some of the strains that we know we'll face on much, if not all, of Massachusetts forest land in the coming decades. In calculating ways in which Massachusetts can offset carbon emissions, it's important to not overlook the issue of forest health and how a strong, decentralized local wood economy can support our climate needs. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate, for your comment. Kurt, do you wanted to respond to Kate suggestions there? Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize. Okay, okay. Go ahead, Kurt. You can unmute yourself now.
There we go. Thank you, Ann. So I would say a couple of things. First of all, land acquisition is an important strategy, just for generally preserving land in order to make sure that the carbon that has been sequestered on it remains on the landscape. I think that is an important strategy that we employ now and can employ more aggressively going forward. Would certainly be part of our strategy and policies that we include as we create CECPs for 2025 and 2030. And there were many other useful suggestions there that we will take note of. Thank you.
All right, we'll next go to Susan Purser.
Oh, thank you so much for this opportunity. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. In order to lower emission levels quickly, I believe the plan must, one, stop logging Massachusetts public forests. The legislature needs to pass legislation to stop logging in Massachusetts public forests. The most immediate way to reduce emissions is to allow our forests to absorb the maximum amount of CO2 with no human management. Given the dire situation of climate change, carbon sequestration must be a top priority. Two, another way to lower emissions is to stop forest destruction for large-scale ground-mounted solar array projects. This should be stopped immediately, along with the subsidies that encourage it. There are plenty of parking lots, brown sites, roofs, walls that can be used for solar arrays. Three, no forest or forest materials should be used for biomass. Logging our public forests so they can be burned up for energy is completely contradictory when the goal is to reduce emissions. All subsidies that promote biomass should be eliminated, as well as the practice of burning any public forest materials for energy. Lastly, number four, no trees from our public forest should be used for cross-laminated timber. The concept of pursuing a new building method that relies solely on large, mature trees is madness at a time when we need to protect our forests. Protect our forests for sequestration. The current 2030 report suggests sacrificing our best mature trees to build 18-story buildings. Can you imagine how many trees that would require? 50 years from now, people will look back and be astounded at how short-sighted we are. This is not a time for CLT from public lands. Thank you so much for your allowing me input. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. So all points, great points. I just wanted to, I have some numbers that I'd like to point out, if I may. The state, so forest land in Massachusetts there's about 3.2 to 3.3 million acres of forest land in Massachusetts. State owns a little over 525,000 of those acres, which is about 16% of all forest land in Massachusetts. And so the majority of the remaining acres, about 1.9 million acres of them, are actually privately owned and not protected. And so certainly your comment about making sure that we manage DCR's land is taken. Just wanted to note that DCR owns a very small fraction of the national working lands, particularly forest land in Massachusetts. And then also DCR will be embarking on their forest visioning process in the new year, which will inform the landscape designation process. So we encourage you to participate in that public process to provide your feedback there. But the Clean Energy and Climate Plan for 2025 and 2030 will focus on broad strategies for the entire state, not just on public land. And then another number that I wanted to throw out there for you, Susan, and others, is that DOER commissioned Mass GIS to do analysis of solar siting for us in the past decade from 2010 through April 2019. The result of their analysis showed that there are about 7,900 acres that has been developed for solar, ground mount solar. 50% of that amount was forested land. The remaining 50% was split up between ag, grassland, and other land cover types. So just wanted to point that out there. Judy, I didn't realize I was muting everyone, so now you can unmute. Did you want to add on anything there?
Yeah, sure. So these are, as you can see, these are very important and topics and not easily black and white topics. And I just want to acknowledge that we are listening to your comments and taking them into consideration. We are interested in protecting our lands and forests to make sure that we have sufficient amount of carbon sequestration and storage capabilities in the future. On the question about solar, we also have heard that loud and clear, because it is just like other ways of using our land, building solar on land or forested land or any other land, ground mounted solar, has an effect on land use, as many other uses of land And this is a tension. Now, the tension is that we do need solar, and we need a significant amount of solar. And I completely agree with you that we should put them on rooftops and, you know, canopies over parking lots and places that are already developed. Well, it's actually not that straightforward. If all else equal, we would like to do that, but not all is equal. And our electricity grid, we have to put solar where our electricity grid has to be able to accept any overflow of solar energy, and not our whole electric distribution grid is not the same everywhere across the state. So while we're also working on that, meaning we need to advance our electricity distribution system to be able to accept the solar, excess solar, right now, there are challenges on the electricity system grid. And having said that, that's also a challenge because most people do not want us to build or us in general society to build transmission and distribution systems, and that itself has siting issues. And so these are complex, interrelated topics, and we are definitely aware of them, and listening to all of you help us understand the intricacies and the importance of all of these factors. So I just want you to know that we're not just pushing ahead an agenda without listening. We are definitely taking your comments into account.
All right. Let's see. We do have a couple more hands, but I see one comment in the chat that I like to bring up since it's related to Susan's feedback. A comment, a question from Dale Labonte. I'm sorry if I butchered your last name. He wrote, I have heard that DCR visioning process will be internal. How will the public be included? So we do have Peter Church online. Peter, would you like to address Dale's question?
Sure. Thank you, Han. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can.
Yeah, so we are at our 10-year review of landscape designations, and DCR will be reviewing it. We will start internally with an internal working group from DCR that covers all aspects of the agency. So it's not just the forestry component, but our park operations folks and engineering and all our divisions. Once we do that, there will be a public component on landscape designations sometime in 2022. So we will be having a public component of the review process.
Great. Thank you, Peter. We're gonna go next to Bart, I'm sorry, Barracius. Could you unmute yourself?
Doesn't work.
Okay, I just unmuted you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, yes, and it doesn't matter how you pronounce the name. It's hard. It's okay. So I noticed this focus. There have been articles saying that the methodology for calculating how much carbon gets stored in these in wood buildings and so forth, and the speed at which wood buildings deteriorate. Houses, for example, usually last about 30 years. Of course, there's all kinds of building techniques in different houses and so forth. But forests can store the carbon much longer than houses can. And also there have been new developments, really important developments regarding the large percentage of recycled steel that's used. Means that steel now in the US has a very small footprint, and it's getting smaller, not bigger. regarding the regular concrete, there have been articles in Nature and other peer-reviewed science journals pointing out that new research on concrete shows that concrete can become a net sink for carbon by absorbing large amounts of calcium carbonate, which is included in concrete anyway, but it can absorb much more of it, and it can actually add to the strength of concrete and so forth. There's also another development, and that's a carbon negative already thing called hempcrete, and that was mentioned by Bill Mumma in one of his presentations, which since it's already carbon negative, it would be much better to be building with things like that than with things that require cutting down mature forests and emitting massive amounts of carbon as a result of that. That's, you know, if someone wants to comment on that, I'd be happy.
Thank you, Bart. All exciting developments that we're anxiously looking to materialize on a wider scale basis. So we're very excited for all those developments, technologies to sequester carbon in non-traditional ways. So that's great. Thank you for that. Kurt, did you want to respond to Bart? And I think Susan also brought up the topic of CLT as well. Do you want to respond to both of those comments related to the similar issues?
Sure. So we are taking a look at cross-laminated timber and other long-lived, long-enduring ways of sequestering carbon as part of our policies in the CECP going forward. And I understand what was just said by Bart, and that there may be other alternatives that we would look at if the science can support them. But we do at the moment intend to look at cross-laminated timber and other mass timber products as a means of advancing our carbon policies.
Great. We'll go next to Zach Porter. I unmuted you, Zach.
Thank you. Appreciate the chance to comment today. My name is Zach Porter, and I'm the director of Standing Trees, which is a new organization based in Montpelier, Vermont, but actually working all across the region on putting forward policies that will promote the restoration of New England's native forests, with a focus on public lands, but looking across public and private. And I've been very closely involved because of being based here in Vermont, with the Vermont Climate Action Plan, which was developed over the last year, as I'm sure you are very aware. And I wanted to share some of the results of that climate action planning process that I hope you might consider for your Massachusetts plan, because it's very relevant to the conversation that we're having today. The plan here in Vermont, which was just released about 2 weeks ago, includes a target that's based on what we call a Vermont conservation design. It's a statewide plan to maximize the resilience of Vermont's natural ecosystems, including forests, wetlands, et cetera. And that plan calls for the restoration of old forests, which are the native forests of New England. These are, you know, the natural land cover of most of our region. They exist on less than 0.1% of our region today. But Vermont has committed with the Climate Action Plan, it is now the state of Vermont's policy to restore 10% of our forest land to you know, what we think of as old forests or old growth forests, which requires permanent protection and passive management. And it's a major commitment from Vermont because we only have 3% of our forests managed in this way today in Vermont. In Massachusetts, my understanding is that the percentage is about 1 or 2% maximum that is managed to someday become old forests. Scientists from you know, coast to coast and all over the globe, E.O. Wilson right there at Harvard and many others have suggested that, you know, we need to look much beyond 10%. You know, 30% is the number that's in the Global Deal for Nature. 50% is the Half Earth vision for restoration of native ecosystems. I think 10% is really the minimum, but it should be the bare minimum. And Wildlands and Woodlands, which is the regional kind of early version of kind of a regional deal for nature, calls for 10% wildlands in New England, including in Massachusetts, of course. And that's been out there for 15 years now. It's widely accepted as kind of the model that we want to be working towards. 70% of our forests conserved, 10% is wildlands. Again, I think that's a low estimate for what we need for wildlands, but it's a huge improvement on what we have today. And so I would hope that in your climate action plan, you would go beyond kind of a broad call for you know, no net loss of forest land, and actually get really specific with a goal for restoring native ecosystems, because we know that they store the most carbon by far. And so if we don't commit ourselves to that now, we'll never get there. It takes centuries for those ecosystems to develop. It requires permanence. So there's been a lot of great comments today on the topic of using public lands as kind of the core areas for that restoration work, and I certainly support that. It will have to include private lands as well. But through your climate action plan, you can make a big step in the right direction by setting that target for 10% at the very least. Perhaps you can go even beyond that. Here it's 10% for forests, but that's additional acreage for rare natural communities, for wetlands that go beyond that 10% old forest figure. So yeah, I would love to visit with you more about this. If more insights from what we've done up here in Vermont with the Climate Action Plan would be helpful for you all, I really hope that you'll follow the lead of the Vermont Climate Council and the Climate Action Plan here and incorporate some really specific targets for your forest-related efforts there. So thank you for the time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Zach, for your comment and suggestion. So I just wanted to put out another number here. I was looking through documents that DCR have on the landscape designation. And in a 2012 document, they said that there is about 111,000 acres of forest land owned by DCR that are in the forest reserve category, which are similar, I think, if I'm correct, to like the old growth, protecting it from like very passive, minimally management activities. And so divide that by 3.2 million acres, that's about 3% Massachusetts land. But certainly the 10% would be a nice goal.
Yes, and I appreciate the correction there. And I think the point is the same, that, you know, across New England, it's about, you know, 1 to 3% that's in what's called GAP 1, you know, according to the USGS protected areas database, you know, status. And so, you know, the minimum that many have called for is really 10%. And so let's start moving in that direction. Let's make sure that our plans are specific enough on that topic to make sure that we actually start moving down the road where we want to go today, because it does take so long to achieve, you know, these outcomes. But we know we can do so much for carbon, for water quality, for biodiversity. Those are all co-benefits of taking those steps to protect our forests and wetlands. So anyways, I really appreciate the time today. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate your comment. All right, we're gonna go. Any other comment from EA folks or DCR folks before we go on to the next person? Okay. All right, we're gonna go next to someone who joined us by the phone. And so last 4 digits of 4333. I unmuted you, can you try to speak?
Am I here?
Yes, I can hear you, this is great.
Great, thank you. This is Janet Sinclair, I'm calling from Greenfield, Mass. I wasn't able to hear all the comments today or all the stuff said. So given that, one of the things that I get really concerned about just in general is any subsidies that we have for residential wood burning. residential wood burning is a local disaster. I'm a witness to that in Shelburne Falls. We have horrible air pollution. And so what happens is over, Mass CEC or DOER, occasionally there are these things to change out your wood stove, only I can guarantee you it's not helpful. I think that, we shouldn't be encouraging residential wood burning at all. We should be encouraging everyone to not burn wood. Of course, it's all related to our, our forests and the whole carbon balance. Another thing I'm becoming quite aware of is, excuse me, is you talked about, the build out for solar and solar in our forests and all that. But on the ground right now, there's a really big problem. So whatever things are in place right now are failing. They're failing really badly. There's clear cutting of these rare pine barrens habitat in the eastern part of the state. On one hand, on the other hand, we have our state agencies out there clear cutting land that's perfectly fine in order to, manufacture these pine barren areas. Kind of a little bit crazy. And also cranberry bogs, they're building solar on top of cranberry bogs, which are technically wetlands. So I would say if I think you asked the question, should there be another topic for these talks here? I would say just the whole solar issue would warrant a whole conversation here because it's really failing awfully. We're watching this large scale stuff happen in Western Mass and in Eastern Mass. And the other thing is whenever we're talking about carbon or carbon sequestering, we're so happy that you're dealing with that side of the equation, but we still need to deal with the other side of the equation, which is there's just not enough talk about energy conservation, and that includes just reduced consumption of everything. I mean, we are heading toward a complete disaster, and we know we have to sequester more carbon, but really it's our consumption that's the problem. And there's nothing great about laminated timber when really what we should be doing is recycling all these building materials, recycling buildings. We just need to be doing that in drastic measures at this point if we're going to have anything be very effective. And the other thing I wanted to mention is there are people that are very concerned still. I know Pete Church is on this call, and Pete knows me. Is that we are really feeling kind of unhappy that DCR is embarking on their forest visioning review without people who were involved last time, especially not not the staff of DCR, who are so knowledgeable. And I think that we should be engaged at the very, very beginning of this. And for the comment about how many of our forests are in reserves right now, between DCR and DFW, it's really like 2.6% of our land base are in reserves, but those reserves are not permanent. They're by fiat. They're by administrative decision making inside those agencies. There's no way for the public to actually have any authority except for the bills that we have submitted to the legislature right now. And we really want those bills to pass because we feel like that's the only way that we're going to be able to get any substantial amount of land permanently into reserves at this point. So I do really encourage you to have a whole separate conversation about solar. There's a lot to talk about. The other thing I just want to mention about the Wetlands Protection Act in the eastern part of the state, it's actually being not enforced by the local conservation commission. These are specific projects in like Wareham and Carver, and DEP that's supposed to have oversight over that is just basically giving a pass at this point. That's my understanding on these Wetlands Protection Act that's very explicit, and it's being ignored because because the solar companies are just plowing right through that land there. This is shameful what's going on out there. So please have a separate conversation about solar. Thanks.
Thank you so much for your comment there. On solar, I don't see Eric Stelzer from DOER here, so I'll relay the information that I know. And then Judy and others, feel free to jump in on this particular topic or other topics that the caller has brought up. So on solar, our DOER is embarking on a study of technical potential, looking at the spatial assessment of where solar could be sited, balancing cost effectiveness with environmental impact, including what is the impact to carbon sequestration and the loss potential of carbon sequestration on the developed land. And so I believe that study will be put out to bid for a contractor response early next year. And it will involve a dedicated stakeholder process to inform the scope of the study, as well as taking the results and coming up with recommendations. And so I believe more information will become available from DOER on this process. I just want to put it out there that we are very mindful that this is a very an area of considerable interest, and so it will have its own dedicated process and study to look into this. Anything you would like to add, Judy, on this or other topics that the caller brought up?
No, you've covered it well. Thank you.
All right.
I just want to add, may I, or am I unmuted, or?
Yeah, I can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Okay, so what I'm suggesting to you is that while DOER embarks on this, process, or whoever's doing it, people are very, very concerned about local control, that our local bylaws are being challenged, that the developers are just plowing through local bylaws. It's very, very upsetting to especially our small towns who don't know how to defend ourselves. I'm in one of those small towns. My town has 1,800 people. It's very, very challenging for us to be faced with these large solar companies who have lawyers and money, and they really are kind of shoving these solar projects down our throat. And I'm not, exaggerating here. But right now, as we speak, this stuff is failing. Like right now, as we speak, these habitats are being lost. Like as we speak, it's not so much a question of waiting for DOER to do something. In case you don't know what's going on, you can just go to the website, Save the Pine Barrens, and you can look at the, really egregious, environmental destruction that's going on there as we speak. And so the people in Carver and Wareham who are faced with all of this don't want to be waiting. People aren't interested in waiting for something to happen a couple of years from now. And anyway, I'm just trying to alert you to that this is actually a problem, currently. And I'm sure that if you had a separate solar thingy here on your, whatever you call it, topic, I think that it might be helpful for you to get some of this feedback ahead of, this DOER study that's being done.
Okay, thank you so much.
Sure.
All
okay,
right.
I'll unmute myself now.
Okay, so we have about seven minutes left, and we have one more person with their hand raised, and I think one question in here in the chat that would be helpful to raise. So I'm going to go to Evan DeLolio. Evan, I unmuted you.
There we go. Thank you. Thank you very much. Evan DeLolio, a resident here in Western Massachusetts. Thank you for putting on this public event today. Two things that I'd like to just make as points. One thing is that in looking at forest ecosystems, they are incredibly diverse. They are incredibly complex. Of course, carbon is a very important factor in how we look at those forest ecosystems. But I think that there's a couple of things that need to be looked at. And one thing is that there's a certain involvement, especially within some of our state agencies like Mass Fish and Wildlife, where certain ecosystems need to essentially continue to exist for very specific types of habitat use. We have species in this state that are in a very serious state of endangerment or potential endangerment when these habitats fail to exist or transform away without the involvement of the state in protecting those species. So that's an important factor, and that still has to be maintained, and sometimes that does obviously result in some harvesting activities that do occur. And at the same time, there's also a very large quantity of diseased trees, of infections that have to be controlled. When you look at the emerald ash borer, for example, which is one pest that we're dealing with in the western part of the state, it has been detrimental to forest health to essentially not be controlling the emerald ash borer. So the reason I raise those points is just that I think the public should be aware that there are many reasons, again, that certain activities do take part in the forest ecosystem, and including the work that's being done by state agencies. But the second point that I wanted to raise is that Massachusetts obviously is a very developed state. And yes, there are other methods potentially of producing concrete, but the majority of concrete, the overwhelming majority used, is a highly carbon intensive based product. And there is the potential for long storing wood products to replace cement in certain applications. And I applaud the state for looking at this as a concept. I think I also want the state at the same time, though, that we need to do more to promote the use of local wood products. I think it's undeniable that there will always be some harvesting going on in this state. And I think that we need to maximize the use of local wood products as much as possible. Over the last 30 years, we have basically lost about 70% or more of our wood-based industries in this state, particularly sawmills and value-added wood product businesses. A lot of that has to do with economics, of course, and other factors, but I think we need to promote the use of this wood, and I think that state promotional agencies within EEA need to work on that as much as possible if we're going to encourage more use of wood products in the state that are also carbon storage tools. Because right now, over 80% of the logs that are cut in this state are leaving the state really by virtue of there being very weak sets of industry currently trying to build those products here in the state. So I applaud you for again promoting these products, and look forward to seeing more promotion in the future.
Thank you, Evan, for your comment. So wanted to talk about the inventory perspective a little more and emissions accounting a little more. We are trying to, and Kurt, feel free to speak more to this since you're more intimately involved with this effort. But we are trying to promote the local wood industry in Massachusetts so that the carbon sequestration that's happening on our land stays in our land, and especially wood from our Massachusetts trees can remain long-term storage in our land. Because if we do export it out to others, and then we import, like another participant mentioned, like 98% of wood that come into Massachusetts or from elsewhere, like if we are importing wood from other states, other jurisdictions, and we combust it or whatever, then that is emission hit in our perspective. And certainly it's, from our perspective, it's good, from an emissions accounting perspective, it's good to make sure that the local economy is protected from that.
Yeah.
So,
I'm also a big supporter of sourcing wood responsibly. And I think to your point, it helps when you know where the wood is coming from. And right now, so much of the wood is coming from places that are outside of our influence.
Thank you. Kurt, I see you unmuted. You wanted to.
Just looking to respond as you asked me to. So I would say that responsibly harvesting locally is something that we have been encouraging. We want to be sure that forestry is done sustainably, but given the amount of wood products used in the Commonwealth, making sure that those are done locally using some of our required forestry practices is something that we would want to do.
Great. Glenn, I think this is a new hand, so we'll go to you. But before we do, just one thing that I wanted to mention from a net emissions accounting perspective, we are going to have a conversation internally, thinking through like the feedstock that are getting feedstock in biomass and biofuel that are currently being considered or already incorporated into different programs, and looking through like what is the emissions profile of them, and then how do they, by their use, how do they impact our net emissions. So that's something that is an effort that we are pursuing. All right, so we're gonna go, let's see, in terms of the time, oh shoot, okay, it's 1:30. Glenn, I know you have your hand up, but since we are at 1:30, why don't we, let me turn to Judy. Like, would you like to answer one more question in the chat, or would you like to wrap it up? And then those who have questions in the chat, feel free to email us and we can get back to you with our response.
Yeah, I think at this point, I want to be respectful of people's time. So we will have more public meetings like this one. And I took tons of notes from the comments already shared here today, including the ones in the chat. So thank you very much for your participation. And, you know, all of our policy making is about striking the proper balance of using our resources wisely and protecting our citizens and businesses. So I very much appreciate your support and continued participation. I think these dialogues are very important to all of us. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I will end the meeting. So thank you, everyone, and wishing you a good Thanksgiving, wrong holiday, Christmas and New Year's. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.